It is an auto computer. That's fine. Since it made it continue. Yeah.
So I think I have 7 o'clock straight up. Is that what everyone else has? Excellent, excellent. So I'm Carolyn Williams. I'm part of the Season Sister series. And this evening, we're going to be having casual conversations with our Black brothers in blue, right? We try to make sure that the time that we have for an hour is utilized to the best of our ability. So we're going to ask you to please remain mute. Please keep yourself on mute. If you want to talk, we love to have you chat, because if you're in the chat room, your questions will be captured by our tech team, which is Deanna and Jade, and they will make sure that you all, if there are questions you have, that they get answered. We also want you to remain on mute so that you don't accidentally go off mute and we hear about everything going on in your household, because I think you all are really going to want to hear from these gentlemen this evening. So it is my pleasure to start this event this evening by introducing my brothers in blue. Right? So the first brother in blue is Dennis Hill. Dennis has 35 years of law enforcement and public service experience. Currently, he serves as interim chief of safety and security for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. Prior to serving with CMSD, he was the commander of the 5th District for the Cleveland Division of Police. While serving in the role of commander, he focused on improving the law enforcement's response to calls for service and encouraging innovations in police responsiveness to community needs. He had a major leadership role in developing and implementing the security plan for the 2016 Republican National Convention, which was held in Cleveland, Ohio. He served as the night duty operations commander, and he was responsible for the entire city during that event. Chief Hill has overseen numerous high-profile criminal investigations, including major narcotics, property crimes, missing persons, criminal gangs, and homicide. Chief Hill is also a member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Chief Hill, you want to give everybody a wave so they know who you are, even though your name is there? Thank you, sir. I'd also like to introduce to you Deon McCaulley. Chief Deon McCaulley has 30 years of law enforcement experience. Chief McCaulley joined the Cleveland Division of Police in June of 1990 and was assigned to patrol and traffic duties in the 5th District. In 97, he was promoted to the rank of sergeant and had supervision of the bike unit, foot beat, and community empowered policing. In 2000, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. And then he was assigned as the officer in charge of the Detective Bureau, Vice Unit, Strike Force, Traffic, and Fresh Start units. In 2006, he was appointed to the rank of commander of the Bureau of Community Policing and oversaw the division's crime prevention and community outreach efforts. In 2010, he transferred to the 4th District, where he served as the commanding officer of the 254 police officers. In 2015, he was appointed deputy chief over administrative operations. 1 week ago, he retired from the Cleveland Division of Police, and he now serves proudly as the chief of police for the Cleveland Clinic Police Department. Chief McCauley he served honorably as a United States Marine, and he is currently the 2nd vice president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Chief McCauley, congratulations, and can you give everybody a quick wave so they know who you are? Mitchell R. Davis has 29 years of law enforcement experience. Excuse me, Mitchell R. Davis III has 29 years of law enforcement experience. He is currently the chief of police for the village of Hazel Crest Police Department in Hazel Crest, Illinois. That is located right outside the south side of Chicago. In 2001, he took his first position as chief of police and has served as chief of police in 2 other departments before going to Hazel Crest. He currently is completing his dissertation on the effect of police culture on their relationship with the Black community for his PhD in organizational leadership at Concordia University of Chicago. He also has a master's degree. He has a bachelor's of arts degree. He is well educated for a chief. I'll just leave it there. Chief Davis was recognized as the 2018 Police Chief of the Year by the Illinois State Crime Commission, received the Jefferson Award for Lifetime Achievement in Public Service. He also serves as a subject matter expert for the evaluation of the Louisville Metropolitan Police Department after the police killing of Breonna Taylor. Chief Davis is the first vice president for the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police and will become president this year, making him the first African-American chief in over the 80-year history of the organization. Chief Davis is a member of the board of directors for the International Association of Chiefs of Police. He's the immediate past president for the South Suburban Associations of Chiefs of Police, and he was the national recording secretary for the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Chief Davis is married, has 4 adult children, 4 grandchildren. He is a man that is led by his faith in God in all aspects of his life. And in his free time, if you can imagine that he has that, he is an avid boater, loves to travel, and is a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. Those are our panel members tonight, and I want you to raise your hand, Chief Davis, so that they know who you are, right? So tonight, our Seasoned Sisters series is going to be moderated by Dr. Iris Cumberbatch, right? One of our Seasoned Sisters. As you all know, Dolores, Iris, myself, and Anita have been doing the Seasoned Sisters series since about July of 2020, yes. So let me introduce you to Dr. Iris Cumberbatch. Dr. Iris Cumberbatch is a communications, marketing, corporate, philanthropic, and government relations executive whose work centers on building bridges between organizations and their stakeholders. She currently is Senior Vice President and Head of Corporate Affairs at ECMC Group in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and previously served in executive leadership roles at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, Wells Fargo, Wachovia Bank, Bank of America, Citibank, and other financial and investment firms. Dr. Cumberbatch earned her PhD in leadership and change from Antioch University, an MBA from Queen's University of Charlotte, an advocate certificate in mass communication from the University of Manchester, UK, and a bachelor's degree in journalism and communication from Pennsylvania State University. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Iris Cumberbatch, who will take the helm and lead these guys through a ton of questions that we have for them tonight. Again, I'm going to ask you to please remain on mute. Please do not take yourself off mute. If you do, our tech team will put you back on mute. If we have time at the end, we'll entertain questions, but we're going to make sure that we give you all the information we think you might want to know about through this conversation. If you really have burning questions,
it wouldn't take long, like
minutes. If you really have burning questions, please put them in the chat. All right. Thank you, Dr. Cumberbatch.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Carolyn, and Chief Mccauley, Chief Davis, and Chief Hill. Welcome to our Seasoned Sisters Speak session in a casual conversation with our brothers in blue. And we're so very grateful to you for joining us tonight. As Carolyn said, when we started the Seasoned Sisters Speak series, we were interested in addressing issues of interest and concern to Black women. And we covered a range of issues from mental health to relationships and many others. And one of the issues that we know is of great concern to Black women in our communities is our relationships with law enforcement. And so we decided that coming into 2021, we would kick off the year with this conversation with our brothers in blue. And so thank you all of you for joining with us today. I'd like to start the conversation by grounding us in what we are talking about when we talk about law enforcement in the United States. And because I like facts and figures, I want to share a few with everyone on the call tonight. So law enforcement in the United States consists of almost 18,000 police agencies across the country. And that includes everything from city police departments to county sheriff's offices, state police and highway patrol, federal law enforcement agencies, and others. In all, there are about 800,000 sworn law enforcement officers in the United States, which is the most that we've ever had. Of those, 85% of officers are male. That compares to males being less than a majority in our country. Only 49% of our population is male, but 85% of our police force is male. That leaves 15% female police officers compared with women being a majority in our country, 51%. In terms of race and ethnicity, 66% of police officers are white, which is more than the 60% of whites in our population as a whole. 13% of police officers are Black, almost exactly the number in the population. 12% are Hispanic, just slightly under the 15% in the population. Only 2.5% are Asian, which is less than half their representation in the population. And then just a fraction are Native American, well below their representation. On average, police officers are 39.5 years of age, almost exactly the same as the average age of our population. And they make slightly more, $69,000 a year in their median salary. So what is the situation today in the United States? Well, we know that the situation is that there is, at the very least, a perception that African Americans face disparate treatment at the hands of police officers. And this is borne out by the numbers. Police killed 1,127 people in 2020. Of those, Blacks were 28%. Despite only being 13% of the population. 98.3% of police killings do not result in a charge to the officer. We know that Black men are more than twice as likely as white men to be killed by the police. And we also know that it doesn't have to be this way. We know that fatal shootings by police in the United States are more than 30 times the number of fatal shootings in the next closest country, which is Canada. So where does that leave us? For today's discussion, we're gonna break this down into 3 areas that we wanna talk to our brothers in blue about. One is the culture of policing, and by culture, we mean internal issues. Things like national policing standards, consequences for police misconduct, excessive force, and racial bias, training in de-escalating use of force techniques, performance management tools like identifying officers who need intervention, best practices in community engagement. So the first thing we're going to look at is the culture of policing. The second thing we're going to talk about is oversight and accountability. Who's responsible for policing the police? We're going to talk about the Department of Justice and task forces, civilian oversight, national databases of problem police, eliminating qualified immunity, and other items that would help us have better oversight and accountability. And then third, we're going to talk about all the things we're hearing about now around reinventing policing. And this includes basically 3 questions. Should we reform police by using things like body cameras and bias training and de-escalation to change policing? Should we defund police by taking away some of the money that police are allocated and spending it elsewhere, like with mental health professionals and young people coaches in our communities? Or should we disband and abolish the police, which is often referred to as the Camden example, where they completely dissolved the police force, started over, made officers reapply for their positions, and completely recast the police force? So those are the 3 buckets that we're going to look at today. But before we start, I would like to start by asking our brothers in blue a question. And that question is, how are you doing? You're all Black men. You were Black men before you were police officers. You'll be Black men after you're police officers. So how are each of you doing in the environment that we're living with today? Chief Mccauley, let's start with you. How are you doing?
All right, well, first, let me say thanks for inviting me to be a part of the panel. I truly enjoy things like this, these types of discussions. I'm doing well, but I'm conflicted. And what I mean by that is I am an African-American male that was born and raised in the Glenville neighborhood in Cleveland, which is African-American. So when I see some of the civil unrest that take place around the country, I agree with some of what's taking place when folks are fighting for their civil rights. As a police officer, I have to stand on the line when a protest takes place. So even though I'm Black, I'm also a police officer that have to hold up the law as well. And that sometimes creates a conflict from within. Of course, I'm going to serve my duty as a police officer that I'm sworn to protect. But when the day is over, I sometimes agree with the reasoning for the protest. So I am conflicted in that regard, but I'm encouraged because as these protests take place, I know change will take place and we will become better as a country, and our folks, our people that look like people of color will have better circumstances as a result of it.
Conflicted yet encouraged. Thank you for that. Chief Davis, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you, Doc, for having me here. Carolyn as well. It's an honor to be here among such esteemed colleagues. A couple words to describe how I'm feeling throughout this process. At first, I say I'm excited. Then I'd say I'm frustrated, and then exhausted. What do I mean by those three things? I'm excited because as a professional, I've traveled the country and I've taught and fought for the need for criminal justice reform long before George Floyd was murdered. That was not something that was new to me. So for me, this is as a time of opportunity. And it's sad the circumstances that brought about this opportunity, but we have to take advantage of it. We have the attention of the world. And for those of us who've been fighting for these things for so long, we have to seize the moment and make sure. So I'm excited about that. I am frustrated at times. Here in the state of Illinois, we just had a House bill pass through our state House and state Senate, and it's sitting on the governor's desk. House Bill 3653, and it's making national and worldwide attention because it has sweeping changes for criminal justice reform. And in my capacity as first vice president of the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police, I've been one of the representatives in this process. So this House bill was generated by the Black Caucus for our legislators here in the state of Illinois. And I guess, it's no surprise that law enforcement is up in arms with this House bill in criminal justice reform. And being the only face in the room for about the last 10 months has been frustrating for me. I'm not hearing anything that I'm surprised about, but when it's in your face and you're having to combat it on a daily basis, almost every day, that does bring about frustration. And through that frustration, that's where my exhaustion comes into play quite often. In that, those of you who know me, a lot of folks are on here know me, I'm not gonna remain silent. I'm gonna speak my piece. I'm not gonna be that person sitting in the room, shaking my head and calling my friends after the meeting saying, man, you won't believe what they said. I'm the one that's gonna be in their face when they say it in the meeting, and they know that. And I'll not be silenced. Because I'm doing what I believe is right and what I believe God has me for. So those are the ways that I'm feeling, and we got to continue to fight the fight.
Thank you for that. Excited, frustrated, exhausted, but seeing this as a time of opportunity. And your experience, particularly in the role that you're playing right now, shows why it's so important to have brothers in blue, right? We need you all to represent us. So thank you for that. Chief Hill, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. I'm honored to be here as well. See so many familiar faces, and just to be amongst such good people and to glean from the wealth of experience on this panel. I describe it much like my brothers, conflicted. I was angry at times, but I'm encouraged and excited. I think both the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd has put an opportunity to highlight what has been going on for centuries. there's been racial inequality and injustice. And now there's a spotlight on things like equity and inclusion and opportunities for all. You know, I work in a school setting, and when we went to a remote environment, we had to put technology in the hands of our students. And why weren't we a one-to-one technology ratio? Why are there zip codes that are redlined? Why isn't there access to the things that other communities have? You know, if we're one of the most impoverished cities in the country, as the stats will show, why aren't greater access being made? But I'm encouraged because I did see the community come together. The philanthropic community came together and helped us get our devices out. I watched people, our staff and others, man food sites and feed our families throughout this whole pandemic. So I'm encouraged, and it's, from a law enforcement perspective, we can't ever go back to what it was. If nothing else, is just put a spotlight on change has to come, reform has to come, and it has to come with the leaders in the room who are making the decisions.
Conflicted. Thank you for that. Conflicted, angry at times, encouraged, excited, and change has got to come. I agree with that 100%. So now that we've checked in on how you're doing, let's jump into some of these questions that we have about policing as an institution. And as I said, let's start with this question of culture, right? And again, by culture, we're talking about things that are internal to police departments and policing: standards, accreditations, consequences for misconduct, excessive force, and racial bias, de-escalation training, performance management tools, and being able to handle officers who require handling, community engagement best practices. So as we look at the culture of policing in the United States as it is today, do you believe police culture needs to change? And if so, what are the one or two top things related to the culture of policing that have to change to restore community trust? Chief Davis, let's start with you this time.
Okay, Doc, thank you once again. Great question, but I want to kind of put a little spin on your question. You spoke on culture and you gave some elements of what you were looking for in culture. So those elements that you're talking about as far as culture is concerned, those are professional elements of culture. To answer the question, yes, the culture needs to change. And those elements, once again, that you spoke on are professional elements. I believe that the greatest cultural change needs to happen from an organizational standpoint. What do I mean by that? Absolutely, from a professional standpoint, we can always get better. Reform, the definition of reform is changing something for the better. So absolutely, we can get better in what we do, but we have systems in place that work. The organizational culture is where I believe the greatest change needs to happen. What do I mean by that? The organizational change is, that's how it is inside your police department or in your community as far as your police are concerned. To give a little bit more detail on that, what we talk about is that we go back to the slave catchers. That was what law enforcement did. We were slave catchers. We go fast forward to Jim Crow. We were the ones that, you know, you had men, women, kids in their Sunday best marching, peacefully marching, and police officers beating them. And you continue to go fast forward with the war on drugs. We were responsible for systemically addressing and attacking communities of color. And that culture is entrenched in law enforcement. And so we can have people who are well-intended people, who are good people, who want to come into law enforcement, but if the system itself is wrong, they may be in a system that they don't even realize is being biased or is treating people wrong, because that's just how it's been. So we have to address that culture. And as chiefs and leaders in law enforcement, it's got to start there. And it's got to be a multifaceted approach, because, you know, culture eats policy and procedure for lunch. We can make all the laws we want, we can make all the policy, all the procedure that we want, but if we don't address the culture, we are not going to change the way things are in law enforcement. So absolutely, culture needs to change. from a professional standpoint, once again, we can always get better, but I believe that the focus has to be on that organizational culture and making sure that we are getting rid of those folks who are thinking the way things have always been and believing that just because a Black community may have a higher crime rate, that they can police by any means necessary to arrest folks. They need to understand that no matter where you live, most folks that live in those communities are good people. And they want the police there to address crime, but they want good policing. They don't want people there that are just mistreating everybody who's in the community. So that would be my response to how, yes, culture needs to change, and that's how I believe it does.
That's really enlightening, because what I hear you saying is that, we have all the policies and the procedures and all of that, that's up there on the shelf, but down here on the ground, we need action, right? We need for culture, for organizational culture to drive the type of conduct in the profession that we want to see. And so I'll be interested to hear in the next set of questions how we make that happen. But thank you for that clarification. Chief Hill, what are your thoughts?
I echo what Chief Davis said. I really think that there needs to be a change in culture. Part of the problem is the us versus them mindset that some police officers have. We are not against the community, we are the community. So the police officers should be entrenched in the community, whether you live there, you work there. I've had opportunities to work in a community where I lived, worked, and worshiped, and kids went to school in the same community. So I think that the police officers need to really change. There needs to be a paradigm shift in behavior and mindset from this warrior mentality to more of a guardian perspective. When we were hired 32 years ago, you got a bulletproof vest, a gun belt, and all the tools of the trade, and you were told to strap on and go out there and fight crime. Well, you didn't win that fight. We can't arrest our way out of the problems that ail this country. And the history of policing is the history of this country. Chief Davis is very correct when we think about law enforcement and what it was birthed in. It's been wrong on so many levels for so long. And culturally, people have accepted that. And we're at a point now where we can't accept that. It was wrong. 30 years ago, if you ran from the police, you knew that there was a tail kicking coming. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. If we're guardians of the Constitution. And we have to make sure that we give quality police service to all people, whether they're in mental crisis, whether they look like me or don't, whether they're having an affiliation that I don't necessarily support. You have to apply unilateral law enforcement ethical principles. And that's where we're falling short, because there seems to be a lack of ethical principles in some communities.
That whole idea of warrior mentality versus guardian mentality really resonates with me. I live in Minneapolis. I live in a city that by now is infamous for police misconduct. And I live in a city where when the police chief, Chief Arredondo, a Black police chief, came in and outlawed warrior training, which is a thing, right? Warrior training is something that lots of police departments send policemen to teach them how to deal with our communities. Well, we don't need warriors in our communities, right? But this is what they train them on. And when Chief Arredondo eliminated warrior training in the Minneapolis Police Department, the police union stepped up and said, you can't make us stop. We will pay for officers to go to warrior training. So I think that whole mentality, when you talk about a warrior mentality, that really resonates with me because I see it at work in my own community. So thank you for that. Chief Mccauley, what do you think?
All right, like Chief Hill and Chief Davis said, the definition of culture goes back all the way to slavery days. When you look at it, our culture today is handed down to us from our ancestors. And you only have to look at recent history to get an example. Using one from the NFL recently, had a running back who made national news and lost his position because he whipped his child with a switch. We know that those types of whippings go back to slavery days. when the slave master whipped the slaves in order to keep them in line. But that became part of the Black culture as it was handed down. In order to keep your children in line, you would whip them. So he didn't think he was doing anything wrong because he thought that was part of culture. But what he was an example of why culture should break at times. And like Chief Davis said, the culture that's been handed down through the police organizations is that exists from the 1950s and the Jim Crow laws and the police dogs and the fire hoses. That's the culture, that's the history of police agencies. Hopefully it's a lot different today, but even still today, it still needs to change. And I think the way that you change that is to make sure that officers are not only held accountable, that they hold one another accountable. Because if I'm working in a car with someone, I'm not going to tolerate that type of behavior. There should be a duty to report bad behaviors between officers. If you had that situation, you wouldn't have had the George Floyd tragedy, simply because those officers would have intervened and saved his life. So yeah, does culture need to change within police agencies? Absolutely. I think you do that through training. I think you do that through holding officers accountable, and through transparency as well. As many agencies now are getting body cameras, make that footage available so that the public can see what the officer sees, and that the officer will curtail his behavior simply because he knows that it's being recorded.
Thank you, Chief Mccauley, and that's a perfect segue. So I'm going to stay with you because the next thing that we want to talk about is this idea of accountability and oversight. You talked about, accountability and transparency. And we need to better understand how we can have oversight and accountability of our police forces through things like the Department of Justice holding them accountable, civilian and community oversight, databases of problem police, eliminating qualified immunity, prohibiting racial profiling and no-knock warrants, and a number of other ways that we have to hold police accountable. And so the question here is, does oversight and accountability of police need to change? And you've already expressed a few ideas for how that might happen. But, can you share one or two big changes related to police oversight and accountability that would have the largest impact, in your opinion, on improving policing?
Okay, from an accountability standpoint, like I was saying before, is officers have to hold one another accountable. Simply put, is what one officer does or allows to happen is going to affect us all. So first, we have to hold one another accountable. But what I would also say is this: I would start to decertify officers, take away their certifications to become police officers. Because what happens is misconduct in one agency that might cause an officer to be terminated, that officer might move on to another agency or another city and become a police officer again, because he's still able to be certified to be a police officer. And I just think that certain conducts should be intolerable and should exclude you from this type of work. So I think that would be huge, is to start to hold officers accountable simply by taking away their ability to perform within this profession, and again, to hold one another accountable in the process.
That is, I think, a really interesting idea. I'd be curious about how you accomplish that nationwide. And if you could just briefly, what does that look like? Does that look like having a database? Is it just that simple? Who are the problem police? Throw them in the database?
Well, I think it can be simple. I think that you face the challenges of unions sometimes, because we have situations where officers will fight to get their jobs back once they're terminated, and they may come back to the same police agency that terminated them. So that is a challenge when you're dealing with the unions. But is it that simple? It possibly could be that simple, simply because there's one, at least in Ohio, there's one board that certifies all officers. It's the Ohio Police Officers Training Association. And if they were to take away your commission, you can't be a police officer for any agency in Ohio. So, I don't want to say it's simple for them to do that, because I don't know what their processes are, but I would think that would be the starting point.
Thank you. Chief Hill, does oversight and accountability need to change? If so, how?
Absolutely. I think one of the problems too is the collective bargaining agreements of the unions. I think that when you look at what a city manager, a mayor, a police chief faces, each one of those individuals wants to take an action against a corrupt or an unjust officer. Every one of them has made up their mind that there's a determination to either suspend or terminate. What happens is the collective bargaining agreement allows for that officer to go through mediation and arbitration and eventually get their job back. I think if there was public involvement in collective bargaining agreements, bring the public in when the OPPA or the FOP is negotiating a contract, and let the public have knowledge of what goes into those collective bargaining agreements, so that the manager, city manager, and mayor is no longer handcuffed. I've seen countless examples where people were fired and should have been fired, and rightfully so, and almost to a person they got their job back for horrible acts that aren't even acceptable in society, let alone in law enforcement. And then the other thing is we need to do better screening, pre-employment screening. It's easier to eliminate a problem before it becomes one. What's predictable is preventable. And I spent 4 hours today with the University of Maryland working on a virtual reality simulator. And it talked about what officers encounter on things like traffic stops and incident reporting and whatnot. And some of the implicit bias that happens every day that officers bring to the encounter. Mm-hmm. Just because he's a Black man with a hood on doesn't mean he's a bad person. If you go to the domestic violence call, just because he's the man doesn't necessarily mean he's the aggressor. So a lot of the implicit bias is brought on the job. So if we can eliminate some of that pre-employment, then that makes it a lot easier, because we can eliminate them before we even bring them into our fold.
Absolutely. Collective bargaining and having some daylight and shining some sunlight on those contracts being negotiated, I think, and pre-employment screening are certainly doable ideas for better oversight and accountability. Chief Davis, oversight and accountability changes?
Yes, ma'am. My colleagues already hit on the major points, but just to kind of reiterate some of the things that I believe are very important. I believe that oversight and accountability are deeply rooted in your first question, culture. Chief McCaulley already talked about how we have to hold each other accountable. One of my dreams, before God calls me home, is that if I could get to a point or see in our profession where we are holding one another accountable at such a high level, but that has to happen with that cultural change. We have to empower our officers so that it becomes the norm, that if somebody's doing something that we know is not supposed to be happening, that they're, without hesitation, no matter who it is, that folks step in. They intercede to make sure that they stop what's going on before it rises to other levels. So, that's a very important thing. It was also mentioned about decertification being a tool. So that culture can be changed through some legislation and policy and procedure, as we talked about before. In the House bill for the state of Illinois, House Bill 3653 in Illinois, one of the major components of that is a new decertification process. I'm actually on that Illinois version of the board that Chief McCaulley was talking about, the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board. I'm actually the chairperson of that statewide board. And with that, that's going to be one of our new responsibilities. And in developing that whole thing, we work very closely with our Illinois Attorney General in developing a process for decertification. And it's just, once again, the frustration part. Sitting in a room, when we develop laws for the everyday citizen, most of us have the mindset that, if you're not breaking the law, then you shouldn't worry about laws out there. But then when it comes to law enforcement officers, they don't want things put in place against us because, well, that'll give you the opportunity to, well, if you're not doing anything, then you got nothing to worry about. But listening to them talk about, and it's, a lot of it is the union folks. That decertification process and how they don't want it. Because as a law enforcement chief, what can happen is arbitrators, as we heard Chief Hill talked about, is that folks get their jobs back. And, you know, we can put some legislation in place that can help us decertify folks. But if we do not couple that with work law and legislation as it pertains to the union labor law and revising that, I can get to a point where I decertify somebody, but then I'm stuck with a $90,000 clerk. They're sitting in my police department because I can't put them on the street because they've been decertified, but I can't fire them because the arbitrator gave them their job back. So it's got to be, I go back to that term again, it's got to be a holistic approach. And that process has to be fair. And even in having that process, we talk about procedural justice. Procedural justice runs both ways. It talks about fairness for both the community and those of us inside of law enforcement. So those are some things that we can do to help to change that culture from an accountability standpoint. And I'll also talk about citizen oversight real quickly. Citizen oversight and citizen participation and collaboration are extremely important at all stages. We heard about hiring the right folks. I use citizens in my hiring process. When I interview, I have my police and fire commission, but I do a chief's interview, and I have a citizen from my community that comes and sits in, and that citizen asks questions to the people that are applying here. So having them involved in that process is essential. And we can be as innovative as talking about having citizens involved in the development of our policy or updating our policy. Asking the community, how do you want to be policed? Tell us how you want to be policed. And as the professionals in policing, we can come up with a collaboration to work out something that works for them as a community and works for us as folks that are in the actual profession. And then as far as oversight, citizen review boards. Boy, oh boy, talk once again, the frustration, listen. So part of this decertification process in Illinois is there's a panel that reviews complaints and decertification. And there are citizens in there. And there are folks that represent law enforcement who don't want they don't know what we do. Why should they be a part of reviewing who we are when they don't know what we do? So as Doc said before, that's why it's so important that we have folks in the room. But we also have to do citizen involvement correctly. I know a lady who is an activist here in the Chicagoland area. She hates the police. She hates the police. I know her, you know, but she hates the police. But she's on a citizen review board. She has no business being on a citizen review board because she cannot be impartial when it comes to judging the police. She hates the police in every aspect. And so while we want folks there, we got to do it right. We want to do it fairly, because that takes away the validity from what we're doing if we don't do it in a manner that's above board. We want to be treated fair. We got to treat everybody fair.
Thank you for that. And I do hope this is the tipping point or the time when we start to have the ability to really take that a holistic approach and inclusive approach that you talked about. You know, everything from having civilians involved in the hiring, all the way through an officer's journey, you know, up to and including, if necessary, decertification. You know, we need to look across the life cycle of policing and start to have some conversations that go from the beginning to the end, and not just hone in or pick on things here and there that will never in totality solve the problem. So thanks for drawing that holistic picture of what oversight and accountability should look like. So the last question, the last general question, is about this idea of reinventing policing, right? So we're hearing a lot about whether we should reform the police. So, you know, body cameras, de-escalation techniques, implicit bias training, a lot of the things that you all have talked about tonight, whether we should do that and stop there, whether we should defund the police. So should we take some of the money away from the police and give it to mental health professionals and coaches to do the things that we don't really want police to be doing anyway? Or should we abolish the police? Should we just, you know, dissolve the forces and start over? So Chief Davis, I'll start with you. Where do you think we should be on this question?
So I'll go back once again to to the definition of reform. So reform absolutely needs to happen because once again, the definition of reform is changing something for the better. It's not a bad thing. And what we have to do as law enforcement professionals, we are always on the defensive when people talk about reform or change to law enforcement. Change it might be uncomfortable, but it doesn't have to be bad. Just because somebody is asking for reform doesn't mean that they're against the police. And as professionals, we always come out boxing, saying, when people talk about reform, and we have to stop doing that and look at an opportunity to move forward and become better. Talking about defunding. When I hear people talk about defunding, most folks are talking about taking away resources from law enforcement and putting them into social services and other things. Well, defunding happened a long time ago. Back in the late 90s, a lot of defunding happened here in the state of Illinois, but it was defunding of social services, substance abuse, homeless services, mental health services. All those things were defunded. The largest mental institution in the state of Illinois are the correctional facilities. They took away the funding for those things. And on a day-to-day basis, where did all the responsibility end up? It ended up on the lap of those folks who deal with everything else that society does not want to deal with, the police. So those social services were defunded. They became our responsibility. We do what we always do. We train, we try to get better. We try to resolve those things. But if somebody's in a mental health crisis, they need mental health professionals to give them the help they need. If somebody's having substance abuse issues, they don't need to get locked up for those things. But that's the position that society has put us in. And now that people are talking about defunding, they want to take money away from law enforcement so that they could put it back into those things that were defunded, but they forget that when they gave us those responsibilities, they never gave us the money that they saved in doing those things. They just gave us the responsibilities. So any chief will tell you, I am barely made, and I'm not talking about having all the bells and whistles, just trying to keep my department running properly. I don't have the funds, and to defund me from that aspect and reallocate funds to other places, while in concept it might be a good thing, in reality for me it is not. And dismantling police departments to me is just, I don't see it as a productive thing. Some folks may think otherwise, but I believe that partnership and collaboration with the community, going back to that collaboration with the community, those who don't want to see the police in the community, you know what? I challenge you. Make your community safe. Make your community do what you need to do as a community, come together and make your community safe. So you have to minimize that police interaction that you have with us. And that will, that's for those who are of that mindset. But that can never be a bad thing for the community to take more ownership. But in that partnership, we're willing to step forward and stand in the gap with you to help address those things that you can address from a community standpoint.
So as is the case with everything, context matters, right? We need to understand how we got here to understand how we move forward. And I think that's a really important point about social services being thrust onto the police, way back when. We've forgotten about that. We've forgotten about the context that got us here. So thanks for that reminder. Chief Mccauley, what should we do? Reform, defund, abolish?
Well, I certainly agree with Chief Davis. Everything that he said about reform is necessary in order to make policing professional again. But now is not the time to defund the police. I think the defund movement was born out of frustration. And I don't think that you make a change in effective change from frustration. I think now is the time to actually reinvest in policing. And that may sound strange to some people, but what I mean by that is that some departments are resource starved. The things that we do have in certain departments don't attract a good candidate for policing. So now is the time to reinvest in technology, whether it be body cameras or dash cameras or intermediate weapons, so that an officer has an option rather than going to deadly force. Invest in those things. Invest in the type of technology that attract a younger officer. the drones and the things that younger folks enjoy. And then you build your candidate pool and you create a better police department. Like Chief Hill said earlier, recruitment is a key part of changing the culture. And once you can bring on a different character of police officer, then you're going to make your reform from within. So I think that this is the time that you actually look at reinvesting in policing and in departments to make sure that they have the things that they need in order to operate effectively and attract a better candidate.
I think that's a great point. And I know, in Minneapolis, we are having trouble recruiting and also seeing a lot of retirements, right? A lot of police officers at this point are just done, for better or for worse, and they're leaving. And so, this concept of reinvesting in our police forces to build the forces we want, I think is a really good one. Thank you. Chief Hill, reform, defund, abolish?
I'm going to speak from my school lens. I truly believe in what Chief McCaulley said. I think now's the time to invest. I have responsibility of providing safe teaching and learning environments for 39,000 students and their families. And I take that responsibility very serious. And the thing that troubles me is that when there should be an investment, best practices say that you should have a metal detector and an x-ray machine, and that you should have some sort of security presence. I'm being challenged by people who say abolish that. Why would you do that? The pipeline to the penitentiary, while it is real in some places, it's not what we teach in CMSD. I think the concept of a school resource officer versus a employee of the school district, I have the opportunity to grow our own fruit. Our officers are employees of the school district. No offense to my colleagues in Cleveland, but they're not Cleveland police officers. They work for the school district. So they get our culture, which is a culture of service to our students and our families. And when I hear abolish mentioned, I ask the people, what do you know about what you want to get rid of? Our officers are doing wonderful things in the school district. We have officers who are coaches and teach chess and tennis and golf, who spend their own money taking children to memorials in DC and whatnot. There's so many things, food baskets, and so many things that people are doing on their own and of their own volition that has nothing to do with their job. But yet you're saying get rid of police. I think that what we've asked our officers to do is to model behavior. That if you can be the best you while you're in the building, they have a strong presence. And I'll be frank with you, our workforce is predominantly Black and Hispanic. Our officers are people of color, and they're men. And so guess what? What does a 17-year-old need to see? A strong Black presence, someone who's professional in his demeanor, someone who's giving him courage, encouragement, and hope, and something to achieve. Not everyone's going to be LeBron James or Lil Wayne, but they should want to aspire to do something that, when done properly, policing is the most noble calling, okay? Because it's a answer of public service, and you're actually going to protect, and you're going into harm's way, you're going into situations where you have to put the needs of others in front of your own. So when it's done properly, it's a very noble profession. The problem is it's not always done properly. And I'll leave you with this. When you say invest or defund, we protect our most valuable of assets. We have an alarm on our homes and cars. We put our money in safe deposit boxes and banks. Why would we not protect our children? In the state of Florida, you can't start a school day unless there's an armed police officer in every school building because of parkland. I don't have armed officers at every building, but I have a security presence. I have someone who's watching to make sure that what's coming into the building is clean, and to make sure that our staff and our community is safe. So yes, there needs to be an investment.
Thank you. When done correctly, policing is a noble profession. I mean, that's something to chew on right there. So we've gotten a ton of really good questions, and we're going to figure out a way to get them answered, but we're not going to have time to answer them tonight. But we really do appreciate everyone sharing them. And as I said, we will find a way to get the questions answered and back out to folks. But we want to spend the last couple of minutes just asking a very simple question, and that is, if each of you could wipe the slate clean and establish the police force of your dreams, what would it look like? Describe it. Chief Hill?
One that has a servant mindset, a person who is truly believing that he or she is working in their set place and answering their calling to help people. One who is rooted in customer service, and one who has the patience and tolerance and temperament to deal with people of a broad range of backgrounds, have those cultural competencies to be able to go into a setting and talk to people like you got some sense, and they do too.
Thank you. Chief Mccauley?
It's a good question. I think that if I had a chance to start a police department, I would make sure that no one in that department thought that they were superior to anyone else. We know that we have officers that go out in the neighborhood sometimes and they think that they are better than the people that they serve. They may have come from a suburban neighborhood, it might be in an urban area policing, and they treat people differently because they think that they're better. Or they may come from the neighborhood that they're patrolling, and because they have a badge on, they start to believe that they're better than the people that they were once a part of. So I would say that I would rid the police department of any officers that thought that they were superior, and that they would have to be fair to everyone that they serve and understand and have empathy for everyone that they service.
Thank you. Chief Davis, you have the last word.
Doc, I would, if I had the ideal police department, I would have a diverse department full of officers that are empathetic problem solvers. Being empathetic problem solver is somebody who is going to try to relate to anybody's circumstances, putting themselves in their shoes, and they're going to do what they need to do to be able to help solve those problems. They need to be thinkers first and foremost. And I need for them to have a guardian's heart, doing what they can so that will allow them in that service mode that Chief Hill was talking about, serving folks and having that guardian's heart. But I also need for them to be able to be warriors when they need to. Because, you know, we can talk about reform all we want, but there's some stuff that happens in our neighborhood that need to be dealt with, but it needs to be dealt with properly and fairly and procedurally just. And if we have somebody that is an empathetic problem solver with a guardian's heart, but that can be a warrior only when absolutely necessary, I believe that that would provide the groundwork for leadership to go out and do what we need to do as law enforcement professionals and truly serve and protect our communities the way that they need to be served and protected on an equitable basis all across the board.
A servant mindset, customer service, patient, not better than the people they serve, fair, empathetic, diverse problem solvers with guardians' hearts, but a warrior, justice when they absolutely need to. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I have really been enlightened and blessed by this session, and so very appreciative, Chief Mccauley, Chief Davis, Chief Hill, and everyone who's joined us for your time. And I'll turn it back over to Carolyn to wrap us up.
Wow, thank you all so much. And thanks everyone for joining. Jade and Deanna, thank you. So it's interesting, my phone has been buzzing. You all have been texting me and sending me emails and everything during the session. And people were saying this should have been 2 hours. You know, we could talk about this all night. We want our questions answered. So we knew that that's where you were going to go because we live in the same communities that most of you live in. So next month we have our Sisters in Blue, right? So we're going to have Chief Vera Bumpers on next week, Deputy Chief Judy Harris on next week or next month, and also Chief Gina Hawkins on. So we'll have our sisters, our Black Sisters in Blue. So we're not done with this conversation. We just wanted you to get a taste of it. And my objective for tonight was to highlight that these are brothers in blue. And what they do all day long is frustrating, aggravating, rewarding, and exciting. You heard all of that. But at the end of the day, each one of them has a servant's heart. Each one of them is a warrior. And each one of them will take their badge and their gun off, put it up someplace and go back into the community and serve on weekends and in the evening, and serving as basketball coaches and little league and football and pee-wee football and taking boys and little girls fishing, right? So those are the brothers in blue that I know. And I thought it was time that we highlight them, because I know if I'm frustrated as law enforcement officers, I know how they're feeling. So I wanted you all as citizens, mostly civilians here tonight, to hear from them. I also want to acknowledge that Chief CJ Davis is on the call tonight. Chief Sheila Mason is on the call tonight. Chief Vera Bumpers is on the call tonight, and SAC Rafiq Ahmad and Deputy Chief Victor McDowell is on the call tonight. So we also have other law enforcement officers on the call who have a passion for serving our community from 7 to 8 o'clock or 6 to 7 o'clock Central Time, just so our citizens, our communities can have this conversation. We want you to take it and go back into the communities and have those conversations in your homes and with your friends. Sorry we didn't get to the questions tonight, but what we'll do is the women chiefs next month, Iris will incorporate your questions into the discussion with them, and you will have your questions answered. Thank you all for continuing to participate. We had as many as 51 folks on here tonight, and it's so just rewarding to know that you want to learn, listen, and earn. So thank you again. We appreciate you all. Could our panelists please remain on with our sisters, seasoned sisters? Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
How are we doing, Jade and Deanna? Is
We're
everybody
okay.
off?
No, not yet.
Who we waiting to go off? Just tell me.
Hold on. They're going out kind of fast. Victor, McDowell, Charlotte, Frederick, Jan.
Call them out. Make them get off the phone. just take them out.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'll just put them in the waiting room.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
And we're just
So excellent job. Excellent job. Excellent job all the way around. We got it in an hour, like we said we would. I'm getting a lot of compliments saying, great job. I recruited one person. She joined because she's always bad mouthing the police, and she was thrilled tonight. That was one of my messages. Thank you. It was excellent.
This is Dolores and
recording.
Anita. They're seasoned sisters.
Can we stop
Yeah.
recording, please?
Yes, please stop recording.